So, greetings, hello. This is Dr. Thomas Daffern speaking, and I'm recording a short address in honour of St. Thomas's Day. Today is December the 21st. It's the Winter Solstice. Actually, in a few hours' time, we come to the exact astronomical part of the Winter Solstice, but this whole period is a very sacred period for the pagan Druid community. People will be at Stonehenge tomorrow morning early to watch the sunrise, and in the Christian tradition it's very important because St. Thomas was one of the most important of all the disciples of Christ and the saints of the Church, and so I'm going to be speaking from that perspective as well about contemporary affairs, global issues that are pressing upon us quite strenuously at the moment, and I'll be addressing them. Such as the question of Brexit, such as the Gilets jaunes, the sad kind of conflicts going on in France and Paris and elsewhere, and the wars that are still raging in parts of the world. I'm addressing this from a peace philosophical perspective as coordinator of European Philosophers for Peace and as coordinator of the World Intellectual Forum here in Europe. We've had meetings discussing what can intellectuals do about these problems. So that's my contribution. I'm recording a short address. In the opinion of this one particular intellectual, these are the kinds of things we can be doing. And my motto would be revelation, not revolution. In the 1968 revolution in Paris, students chalked up on the walls, pouvoir à l'imagination. So, power to the imagination. The point is that authority, control, power in society is dominated by those who control our imaginations, who control our knowledge, and who control our access to knowledge, and who determine what is authentic knowledge versus what is inauthentic. This is something I've addressed in my philosophical opus magnus, which is called Being and Knowledge, and which I'm about to publish, the first volume of it. I've gone into this in the way that Heidegger looked at being and time, and the way that Sartre looked at being and nothingness, and the whole philosophical tradition of European thought, going back to Aristotle, argues that ontology, the scientific study of being, is the main and primary job and duty of a philosopher, and I would agree with that 100%. So, but also we pursue knowledge as human beings. So I'm exploring this complex dialectic between our being nature, which is, some people argue, is divine, given by God, given by the gods, something sacred, and our epistemological qualities, our knowledge dimension. And there's a mismatch between that, and how they're controlled and organised in society is what demarcates social power and social structures and social hierarchies, which is something I've studied in great detail and explore in my book and in my other writings. And today I'm also celebrating, therefore, all the Thomases of history. I'm merely one of them, but I've written a multi-volume work called the Book of Thomases, which is the first time anyone has pointed out there's never been a King Thomas or a Pope Thomas in history. Plenty of popes called Peter and John and Paul and all the other disciples. Never been a pope called Thomas, never been a king even. The only Thomases we've had in history are philosophers and sages, people that stand up against power, like Thomas à Becket, who uttered a curse against the corrupt English people that were trying to kill him from Vézelay, near here, a cathedral dedicated to Mary Magdalene, one of my heroines. So Thomas Hobbes was another great Thomas, and he's referenced in my directory of Thomases, which was a labour of love for me to compile over about 20 years of study. Everyone from number 52, Thomas Corbishley, a Jesuit who died in 1976, one of the greatest intellectuals of British history, and a great European, and many other great Thomases in history, including some obscure Thomases many you would have never heard of. I'd never heard of them until I started doing the research. And I would come across obscure Thomases in plaques on country churchyards and so on, throughout the whole of Britain and the whole of Europe, and everywhere on my travels. Lots of people in India called Thomas, because Thomas the Saint went to India and he was sent by Christ to go east. The other disciples were sent west or to other regions. And in the Acts of Thomas, it describes his journeys to India and the adventures he had there. I've been to the hill in Madras, or Chennai as they now call it, where he was martyred eventually by some fanatical Hindus who, there was a communication problem between these Christian missionaries and the indigenous spiritual elders of the area, who were doing quite nicely with their own hierarchy of power. Thank you very much. Don't come and tell us about this Messiah chap and his resurrection. That might upset the apple cart. If everybody knew that, they can all access equidistantly the ethics of the kingdom of God, well, that might cause trouble to me and my power hierarchy, etc. So Thomas eventually died a martyr's death, but there are many people in southern India who look back on him as a great light bringer. And I've met some of them. I've been down to South India several times. One of the other great Thomases today we celebrate is Thomas Hobbes, who was a great savant in the 17th century in Britain. He lived at a time of the tragedy of the English Civil War, the British Civil War, when the armies of England, Scotland, Wales, rampaged over the country. There were monarchists, there were anti-monarchists, there were republicans. Plus ça change. I actually suggested to the syndics of the University of Oxford Press a few years ago that we should publish an encyclopedia of the English Civil Wars, or the British Civil Wars. They never took up on the project because, it's an extraordinary thing. There's never been a historical encyclopedia of the entirety of the Civil War period in British history. And I thought maybe 400 years on, it'd be time to, edit this and get the leading historians of the British Isles and other specialists from abroad who have knowledge in this. Like my friend Ronald Hutton, Professor of History at Bristol. His PhD was on the structure and the form of the Royalist Army during the English Civil War. And many great, in fact I discussed it with Ronald whether we could organise this encyclopedia, and he suggested a few names. I think it's a valid project and should be done, but Thomas Hobbes would certainly figure in that dictionary because he watched this Civil War in horror, really. He was, like any great philosopher, he could see truth on both sides. But his instinct was more royalist than republican. He certainly didn't believe in getting rid of monarchy. He thought it was a good symbol for the solidity and stability of a nation to have a king or a queen. But he thought it should be, within certain bounds of constitutional propriety and also within bounds of natural law and divine law. There's cosmic justice beyond the kind of monarchical figurehead. Some kings and queens are wiser than others. Some are more aware of the divine duty of embodying true justice. Some of the greatest monarchs of history, like King Alfred the Great and so on, these were truly honourable and just people. And so, anyway, Hobbes was a genius who'd worked with philosophers and scientists. He'd been the private secretary to Lord Bacon, the founder of the philosophy of science in Britain. So he'd sat and, you can imagine the conversations they would have had, extraordinary discussions. And then he went to Italy, he met Galileo, and he had private discussions with Galileo. He came to France, he met Mersenne, Gassendi, and other great philosophers and intellectuals in Paris. What he tried to do, old Hobbes, is apply physics, this new science that was looking at things in terms of gravity and mass and weight and acceleration and speed, in measurable quantities. Galileo was founding modern physics, if you want. He tried to apply that kind of thinking to politics. Hobbes said, let's do a natural science on politics. Let's look at politics just as scientists. And he wrote some extraordinary, way ahead of his time books, in which he argued that power is the fundamental gravity in society. It's the force that you have to measure if you want to scientifically study politics. And he, in a sense, took Aristotle's concepts of political science and then updated them in the light of 17th century scientific knowledge. Hobbes even met Descartes. He was a real polymath, or as I call it, a polysavant. He lived in exile in France during the outbreak of the terrible civil war, and he became tutor to the young future king, Prince Charles II, who would eventually become king. He tutored him in mathematics, which is typical. Hobbes loved maths. He loved being able to say the exactitude of how power and force in society can be measured and constrained. Now, all of Hobbes' work was dedicated to the advancement of peace. This is why, as a peace philosopher, I honour and celebrate his work today, because he was a true Thomas in that he was looking for the key, the intellectual key to understanding peace in society. We still haven't got there. If Hobbes were alive today, he would be scratching away with his pen, working desperately on how to get peace. And I think he would be very concerned about things like Brexit and the implications constitutionally for the future of the UK and its probable breakup. And also his concern would be for the French people and this kind of bifurcation that's going on between the poor, the gilets jaunes, the ones who just can't meet the bills every month, and the kind of elites, the bankers, the middle class, upper middle class, thank you very much, we're doing fine, which Macron represents. How on earth can you bring peace dialogue between these two factions? And they exist in every society. They exist in the poor in America, on the streets of LA, living in tent cities, in the richest country, supposedly, in California in the world. And yet there's vast numbers of poor who are having serious problems, can't afford medical bills, insurance, you've got to be joking, etc., etc. So if Hobbes were alive today, he would be taking that Thomas perspective, which is suspending judgment on preconceived truths, looking at things through doubt, because this was what the Apostle Thomas gave us, the duty of sacred doubt. If some fanatic comes to you and says, this is what's true, X, Y, Z, you have the right to do a Thomas on them and say, excuse me, where's your evidence? Where's your proof? That's what this Thomas tradition is all about, and that's why it's what I would call scientific spirituality. And it's so important within the heritage of European thought. Giles Quispel, one of the great academic experts on the history of religions, a Dutch scholar, argued that the Gnostic tradition was the third dimension to European intellectual history. We have the Catholic faith and the Protestant answering faith. And by Catholic, I would include the Orthodox. It's actually one thing, really. Then you have the Protestant counter, but you also have the Gnostic tradition, which Quispel rightly said is the hidden golden stream that comes down from, I would argue, actually from the source. I would say that Jesus, when he was teaching with Mary Magdalene, with Thomas, with John, with his innermost disciples, they were discussing what we would call Gnostic truths, which is the science and the forms of enlightenment, how to achieve self-knowledge and how to attain enlightenment. This is the Buddhist way of talking about it, or the Hindu, but Gnosticism is the Christian form of Buddhism, or Christian form of yoga, or Hinduism, or Jainism, which has the same concept. The one who can cross the stream of suffering, the Tirthankara, is the one that brings enlightenment and makes it available to the masses. This is a potential thing that we all have within us. We all have that enlightened Buddha mind, or that Christ mind. Thomas's mission was to make that plain to people. And I would say that these Thomases ever since have been trying to do that. Thomas Jefferson is another, Thomas à Becket. There's actually 2,000 Thomases I found, and I'm working on bringing out the volumes. There's a lot of work gone into it. What would then Thomas Hobbes and the other Thomases make of Brexit? I just want to address that. Many of my friends and colleagues know that I've been speaking out quite strongly against Brexit, and I've published a journal which gives, I think, the most details. I've never seen in print anyone else who's done the intellectual work to synthesize. There's lots of datas and things going on. There have been court cases showing and proving that Vote Leave broke the law, showing that there was undue influence from probably international sources, that the international financial institutions offshore stand to benefit from Brexit. Not the average ordinary English or British working class person. They're going to be hit so hard that it'll be like World War II. They won't know what's coming. And all the sweet talking of Theresa May and all her cronies is simply disguising that fact. You know, she's living in what I call Shambhala La land, a kind of paradise of incompetence, who simply haven't done the homework. I mean, I once met Theresa May, and I'm unbelievably disappointed in her narrowness of mind and her interpretation of this referendum as meaning, oh, we've got to do it. You know, June 2016, date set in stone. Let's do it. You know, any person in their right mind realizes the first law of political science is flexibility, adaptability. That's the very definition of human intelligence. We only got to be a species fairly dominant on this planet is because we develop flexibility of intelligence. You know, and a rhinoceros does rhinoceros things. It charges with its horn, that's it, get out of the way. Buffalo, very clever, but that's what they do, buffalo intelligence. Dinosaurs, very, very amazing, powerful, much more powerful than us, but they just did their one thing. You know, Tyrannosaurus charges through, eats everything, bashes it. Whale, great sharks, you know. We, in the hominid line, which we've perfected and brought to fruition, are the monkey mind of humanity. The monkey is my astrological sign in East Asia. And I'm proud of that. You know, we are the monkey descendants. The Tibetans say humans are descended from monkeys. Funny that, isn't it? Darwin said the same. But I would say that it's that flexibility of intelligence that we can try our hands at everything. You know, I'm a musician, I can play guitar, I can play piano, I can swim, I can dance, I can write poetry, I can do philosophy, I can do history, you know, etc., etc., etc. You know, I can even do some, you know, practical stuff around the house, you know. And that's right, we should all be Renaissance people, we should all be flexible and multitasking. The problem with these politicians is that, and I think it's true of both Corbyn and Theresa May, you know, they have a position, they adopt it, and that's it, there's no budging them. It's like a car. Now, if you see it going over the cliff into the abyss, we the people, at whatever level of society or education or whatever, we have a duty to actually effectively riot and protest in the strongest possible terms when our foolish leaders are driving us off a cliff. All the indications are that Brexit will be an utter disaster for the UK, for the British people living abroad, for the Europeans living in Britain. And it's 99.99 recurring % certain, based on my time of living in Scotland and my dear Scottish friends and my understanding of Scottish culture, that Scotland will quite rightly demand and achieve a second referendum on independence once Brexit is imposed on them from Westminster. Nicola Sturgeon has been, you know, attempting to be moderate, attempting to kind of work with the Prime Minister, who simply has no conscious understanding of the Scottish character and is steamrolling this English Brexit, onto the Scottish people. I think, quite rightly, they will revolt, they will do it democratically, they will have a second referendum, and they will leave the Union, the UK. And very probably, almost certainly, they'll be welcomed back into the EU within, you know, a very short time of negotiation. Just think about that for a second. The implications for the UK is that it now breaks up. It's been together as a nation since 1603, when King James of Scotland, one of the wisest monarchs, again up in the league of King Alfred the Great, in terms of his learning and education and knowledge, friend of Francis Bacon and patron of the arts and scholarship and so on. When King James brought these countries together into a personal union, his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was Catholic, a great woman in her own right, who spent a lot of time here in France, where I'm recording this. And that wonderful TV series, Reign, gives a kind of romantic view of Mary Queen of Scots' time in France, but it's beautiful, you should watch it. That was James's mother, you know, he was an amazing man. And he loved Britain, he loved Scotland, he loved England, he loved all of it. And he wanted it to flourish in peace, in a Europe at peace. And that's why he tried to stop the religious wars that were breaking out on the continent. He was both a Protestant and a Catholic. He'd been baptised a Roman Catholic, he was raised and educated as a Protestant, and he eventually became king of Great Britain and head of the Anglican Church. So he was a Catholic Protestant, which I would argue is my position. But I'm also an Anglican, but I'm one that's very much versed in the Gnostic Thomas Church, the Thomas traditions, as I think James was too, although he didn't have time to devote himself to scholarship as much as he would like, no doubt. Being a king takes time. As King Alfred the Great used to complain to Asa, his bishop, I have no time to read. Is there going to be a library in heaven where I can catch up with all my studies? And Asa said, yes, O king, there will be. If there isn't now, they'll build one specially for you. So that's a true king who loves learning so much that they want to go on studying after death, which is my position. So Brexit then is going to threaten that entire project that we've been working on since 1603, which gave us Shakespeare, which gave us modern scientific discoveries, it gave us the railroad, still a very amazing invention and one that should be perfected to run on, non-polluting fuel and so on, as it's been doing in Germany. There's now a hydrogen-powered train, which is, all trains should run on hydrogen, really. That whole experiment, which has given us modern, English literature, and the what we now call the Commonwealth. I was born in Canada, in Montreal. Commonwealth is an amazing thing. New Zealand, Australia, India, these wonderful countries that have all got a deep love for English literature and philosophy and science and law. The mothership is about to self-destruct. I mean, it's incomprehensible to me as a Canadian Brit that the UK, which I love dearly, and I've lived there for many, many years, in all parts, Wales for 10 years, Scotland for 7 years, London, Brighton, etc., that it could be about to self-destruct. I mean, I find that is about as intelligent as a chicken coming to you and saying, I'm about to cut my head off. What kind of a crazy chicken would that be? You'd stick it in a mental home. So I've tried to analyse politically, and I think with Hobbes I would say that there's two kinds of power in political things. There's centripetal political power and there's centrifugal political power. The centripetal is the name we give to energy that moves towards the centre, and it was a term coined by Newton but inspired by Hobbes' work. And Hobbes argued that in politics, sensible, moderate, peace-loving energy moves towards the centre. It comes in from the extremes, and it, like the heart, and the Rosicrucian movement made much of the heart, which was around at the time of Hobbes. It was trying to say, look, you shouldn't be a Catholic or a Protestant, etc., etc. You should be everything all at once. You should come from the heart of the Christ light, which transcends your sectarianism. And that was the place that Kant and his tradition tried to come from. What is the transcendental consciousness at the heart of being? That's where Hegel was trying to come from. And Leibniz, consciously, as a Catholic Protestant wandering philosopher like me. So from that perspective, Brexit makes no sense. The extremist Brexit rhetoric of Daniel Hannan and Michael Gove, and which has been adopted by Theresa May, Boris Johnson. I mean, these people are not intellectuals. I'm sorry, they haven't got that heart energy, that understanding that love is the fundamental force that binds and keeps a society and a country and a civilization together. Where they're coming from is a place of hatred and fear, and I've listened very closely to what they've argued about the European Union. I now live within the European Union's heartlands here in France, and I have many, many friends, some of whom work for or have worked for the European Union or been funded from them. It is a very civilized kind of way of organising international relations. Its primary purpose was peace and the advancement of solidarity between nations. It was dreamt up, this idea of gradualism, by a great thinker in America, David Mitrani, who was a savant at Princeton School of Advanced Studies alongside Einstein, and who was given this idea of creating a federal compact between nations that could prevent war and destruction. Unfortunately, the people that are breaking up the European Union with their rhetoric and their nationalism, lacking that heart and energy of centripetal consciousness, are risking the return of civil war in the UK and, God forbid, but even in Europe. We've lived through 2 world wars. My mother was born on the 1st of January 1914, before World War I. She devoted her entire life, having lived through 2 world wars, to peace. And you can see the mirror behind me that was in my mother's house in Brighton for many years when I grew up as a boy. Inheriting from her that passion for peace. And it's the most important cause that we can work for. To me, it's within that true Christian tradition of a holistic seeking for wisdom and for holistic light that this day, that's why St. Thomas's Day is the winter solstice. It's in the middle of that darkness. We're stuck in this crazy Brexit-obsessed, rhetorical madness, and yet in the midst of all that, there is a light which can be reborn, a light of wholeness. And this is why I say as a motto, revelation, not revolution. The Brexiteers argue it's a revolution. Of course it is, but it's a destructive one. The army are now saying we'll need to police the streets. The government has issued orders expect a huge increase of suicides post-Brexit. They're now talking about a hard Brexit with no deal, nothing. Just like leaving the party with no agreement, walking out on Europe, which is the most irresponsible possible political move I've ever heard of in my entire lifetime. It's incalculable in its stupidity. And it will lead to... The only people that will benefit from it are the lawyers, who will then spend years trying to disentangle the chaos and renegotiate everything. The politicians, who can feel very self-important about having inflicted this suffering on the people. The army, who will benefit from increased pay because they'll be very busy policing the streets. The police, for the same reasons, because they'll be busy enforcing law and order, on starving mobs. And ordinary people will be the last. Oh, and I should mention the rich financial interests that have their money parked in the Cayman Islands and Jersey. They will benefit, and they're already, sharpening their knives to carve up the British economy and basically acquire it on the cheap after the pound plummets and falls, which will happen after a hard Brexit. So I'm perplexed and bemused that the BBC, that the media don't actually talk about actually what's happening. I think what's happened is that the BBC are basically have been captured and taken over by British intelligence. And this isn't conspiracy theory, this is a fact. People who've worked there, people who've studied the way that senior BBC appointments are made, you're vetted by British intelligence if you get to be up a certain pay grade. And if you're not spouting the party line at any one time, then I'm afraid it's no-go for you. And we've seen that this is reflected in the way the BBC parrot the government's party line on Brexit. All rival discourse, all the kinds of things I'm explaining. You won't hear this on the BBC because it's vetted out. And I think it's wrong that a policy which is so fraught with danger and constitutional crisis can be simply steamrolled through. What's happened is Theresa May and her cabal of cronies who captured the Conservative Party against the best interests of the actual Conservative Party, which is represented by people like Dominic Grieve and Ken Clarke and Anna Soubry. These are genuine Conservatives. I thought David Cameron was one, but he turns out to have the feet of a spider. That they should have been speaking up for the benefit of the whole of society in the authentic original Conservative tradition of Burke, Croker, Walter Scott. The first founders of the Conservative Party were people that believed in rejecting the project of violent revolution, preserving the institutions of society, but moderating and humanising and bringing them up to date in such a way that all people could live in harmony and peace. That vision, it used to be called One Nation conservatism, seems to have be on the verge of surrendering to my cabal conservatism, which is the complete opposite. Theresa May continues to try and trumpet the notion of One Nation conservatism by saying, we, the British people, have voted, I'm just doing the will of the people. But it's a complete misreading, it's a false narrative. This is a woman who's never studied political thought, who probably doesn't know the difference between Thomas Hobbes and Thomas à Becket, who probably has never actually thought through the implications of what she's doing. And there's such a thing as deliberate myopia. There's a conscious, willful blindness. I, as a teacher, know the type because I've taught many, many different types. Some people, grammar school kids, like Theresa May, they think they're clever. They reach a certain plateau of knowledge, and then they shut down to any further input. They won't listen to rival views or perspectives. And she's got that arrogant attitude when she's attacking Corbyn in the Commons. She's mocking him for his less intelligence, as she says, and thinks that, by scoring points against him, she's proving her own intelligence. To me, it just proves her moral imbecility, because this woman is misusing her intelligence. She's now, she's fairly intelligent, but she's misusing it because she's blocked off from hearing alternative perspectives. And she's misusing the instruments of state, the intelligence, so-called intelligence of the British state, to then impose her vision of what is truth, which is Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. Up to the point of a hard Brexit. Well, that is actually treasonable, because she's actually bringing about the destruction and demise of the UK state because of her own lack of knowledge, her own lack of stateswomanship, her own lack of wisdom. And I think the Conservative Party and the other people in the Commons should simply vote her out. That's the only strategy. She needs to go, and ideally go back and do a degree in political science. She should study Thomas Hobbes and the peace thinkers of our era. And we should have a general election for a true leader to emerge. She said she wouldn't stand. Fantastic. And we also need a second referendum, because the people of Britain, I think, have largely changed their minds. I've certainly changed it by becoming ever more committed to Remain. And I think we deserve a second vote. My original vote was never counted at the referendum back in June 2016. The envelope was returned unopened. Very suspicious, I thought. But then there were lots of dodgy things about that referendum. People were never told the truth. Nothing was on offer of actual explanation of the implications. We didn't know the implications. Now the British people have a really serious idea of what's going to happen after Brexit, which is absolute impoverishment of the country, and destruction and chaos in the breakup of Scotland and the rest of England and Wales, and also, and I haven't yet mentioned, but incredibly important, turbulence in Ireland, probably a resumption of the time of Troubles, violence on the streets of Belfast, which was a horrendous thing to have lived through. I remember bombs going off all over the UK. The Irish nationalist community will not take kindly to a Brexit forced on them and the reimposition of a hard border with the south of Ireland. Again, the politicians in England, in Westminster, haven't got a clue about the true understanding and wisdom and depth of Irish commitment to peace, and therefore its commitment to the European Union project. Ireland has benefited and flourished, both north and south of the border, by peace, which was largely brought about at the time of Tony Blair and Mo Mowlam's negotiations because of the backdrop of the European Union. It made possible a stability. And to sacrifice that and throw it away, I disagree with Tony Blair 100% over his Iraq invasion in 2003, but I admire and respect him for now signalling to the British people that we need a second referendum and that peace in Ireland is at stake here. I find it incredible, the ignorance of many English people over Ireland. We're never taught the history of Irish culture and philosophy and religion. We're never taught about the history of Ireland. We're never taught that the Irish were literate and civilised and highly advanced intellectually when the